He didn't look like a monster. He looked like an accountant. Yet, this man was the logistical architect of the final solution. For 15 years, he was a ghost, hiding in plain sight. Then came one of the most daring spy missions in history, a secret hunt to drag him from the shadows and force him to face the world. This is the story of Adolf Eichmann and the chilling search for the man who perfected the bureaucracy of death. The Rise. The story begins not in chaos, but in quiet mediocrity. Otto Adolf Eichmann was born in 1906 into a respectable middle-class family. His father was a bookkeeper, a man of numbers and ledgers. It was a world of order and rules, a world Eichmann would come to understand perfectly. His childhood was unremarkable, average school grades, a brief attempt at engineering school. He was a joiner, not a leader, drifting into a youth group called the Wandervogel. On the surface, it was innocent, a celebration of nature and tradition. But it was also a reaction against the modern world, romanticizing a past, purer Germany. It was perhaps the first seed planted, the idea that German culture was something precious, something that needed to be purified. The world he entered as a young man was anything but pure. The Great War had shattered the old empires, leaving Germany defeated and humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. The economy collapsed. People were jobless, starving, and desperate for someone to blame. In this cauldron of resentment, extremist movements festered. One, in particular, offered a seductive message. The Nazi Party. They promised to restore German greatness. And they provided a simple scapegoat for all of Germany's ills, the Jews. For a time, Eichmann remained adrift, working as a traveling oil salesman. But in 1932, a family friend persuaded him to join the Austrian Nazi Party and its paramilitary wing, the SS. For Eichmann, it wasn't a profound ideological awakening. It was a career move. It was a uniform. It was somewhere to belong.
Totalitarian movements are incredibly seductive to people who feel invisible. Eichmann wasn't a street brawler. He was a man who craved a system, a set of rules to follow. The Nazi Party didn't just give him a job, it gave him an identity and a sense of power he could never have achieved on his own. He didn't have to create meaning for his life. The ideology did it for him. His job was simply to be efficient at its execution.
He had found a system. His superiors saw potential in the quiet, diligent young man, not on the battlefield, but behind a desk. He was recruited into the SD, the SS Intelligence Service, and in 1935, assigned to a new department, the Jewish section. Here, Eichmann found his calling. He approached the Jewish question with the cold efficiency of a bureaucrat. He studied his enemy in order to control them. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, Eichmann was sent to Vienna to handle the Jewish problem there. His mission? Accelerate their removal. He created the Central Agency for Jewish Emigration, a masterclass in bureaucratic terror. It was an assembly line of despair, streamlining the process of stripping Jews of their property and forcing them to flee. In 18 months, he purged Vienna of 150,000 Jews.
The system Eichmann established in Vienna was a terrifying turning point. It proved to the SS leadership that you could conduct ethnic cleansing not just with violence, but with administration. He turned terror into a clerical process. He made robbery and deportation a series of forms, stamps, and timetables. This is why he became so invaluable to them. He was the master of organized terror.
To his bosses in Berlin, he was a star performer. He had proven that you could solve a human problem with paperwork. Adolf Eichmann, the failed salesman, was now an expert in forced migration. The confrontation. But as the Nazi war machine conquered Poland and then Western Europe, the scale of Eichmann's problem exploded. The Reich now controlled millions more Jews. Emigration was no longer enough. A more radical solution was needed. One of the first grand schemes was the Madagascar Plan, a proposal to ship 4 million European Jews to the African island, to live and die in a giant open-air prison under SS control. And Eichmann was its chief architect. He drafted the master plan, writing with the chilling detachment of a city planner about shipping schedules and logistics. He called it a territorial final solution. But when the British Royal Navy blocked the seas, the plan was shelved. It was impractical. A new final solution would be required, one that could be carried out right there, in the heart of Europe. The logistics were finalized on January 20th, 1942, at a meeting in the quiet Berlin suburb of Wannsee. The purpose of the conference was not to decide to commit genocide. That decision had already been made. It was to coordinate the how. And sitting at the table, taking the official notes, was the expert on Jewish affairs, Adolf Eichmann. He brought the lists, meticulous catalogs of Jewish populations across Europe. His job was to help organize the machinery of murder. The plan was now set. A genocide organized with the cold logic of a corporation. The story of how Eichmann and the Nazi state turned this horrifying blueprint into a continent-wide factory of death is a harrowing but essential part of history. Exploring these difficult chapters in full detail is our commitment. By subscribing to this channel, you support this work and join a community dedicated to ensuring these stories are never simplified or forgotten. At his trial, Eichmann would argue this was a simple bureaucratic task. He just arranged the timetables, a small cog in a vast machine. But a train schedule, when the final destination is a gas chamber at Auschwitz or Treblinka, is a weapon of mass destruction. A signature on a transport order is a death sentence. His most horrific achievement came in 1944. Germany was clearly losing the war. Yet, even as the Third Reich crumbled, Eichmann dedicated himself to one final, terrible task: the annihilation of the Jews of Hungary, Europe's last intact Jewish community. In just 8 weeks, he orchestrated the deportation of over 437,000 people to Auschwitz. When even his own superiors, sensing the end was near, ordered him to stop, Eichmann defied them. He continued the transports. This was not a man just following orders. This was a man driven by a fanatical commitment to his mission. He would later boast to a fellow Nazi that he would leap into my grave laughing, knowing he had the deaths of 5 million people on his conscience. He saw it as an accomplishment. The resolution, but the laughter would stop. As the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, its leaders were killed, captured, or committed suicide. And what of the meticulous manager of murder? In the chaos of Germany's surrender, he was captured by American forces. But to the victors, hunting for the big names, the generals, the ministers, the camp commandants, Adolf Eichmann was not yet understood to be the central logistical cog in the Holocaust machine. He was just another SS officer among tens of thousands. And so, in the summer of 1946, from a prisoner of war camp, a ghost walked free. Not with a dramatic escape, but with the quiet shuffle of a man who knew his greatest asset was his own anonymity. For the next 4 years, the architect of the final solution became a lumberjack in the German forests. He was not, however, entirely alone. In the shadows of a defeated continent, a network was forming. A perverse underground railroad designed not to save the persecuted, but to spirit away the persecutors. It was called the Rat Line.
The Rat Lines weren't a centralized organization. They were a loose collection of like-minded individuals. Former SS officials, sympathetic clergymen, corrupt bureaucrats in neutral countries. They all played a part. The key wasn't sophistication, it was shared will. There was a desire in parts of Europe to let these men vanish. For a fugitive like Eichmann, all he needed was a few reliable points of contact and one good forged passport. At the time, that was enough.
This was not a centralized organization, but a loose collection of like-minded individuals, former SS officials, sympathetic clergymen, and corrupt bureaucrats who, for ideology or money, were willing to help. In 1950, with help from this network, Eichmann arrived in Rome. He was given shelter, and eventually, the document that would be his passport to a new life, a Red Cross passport, issued in the name of Riccardo Clement, a Catholic mechanic. With this document, Adolf Eichmann ceased to exist. He boarded a steamship in Genoa, bound for Argentina, a nation that had become a welcoming sanctuary for thousands of former Nazis. His first years in Buenos Aires were not glamorous. He was, once again, the failure he had been before the party gave him power. But in the large, tight-knit German expatriate community, his fear began to fade, replaced by a slow-burning arrogance. His family joined him. Life took on a semblance of normalcy. But beneath the quiet facade of Riccardo Clement, the ego of Adolf Eichmann was stirring. He needed to talk. He needed his greatness to be recognized. In 1957, a Dutch Nazi journalist named Willem Sassen began a series of interviews with him. The tapes they recorded are one of the most chilling documents of the post-war era, revealing the true man behind the mask. Here, there was no talk of being a small cog. There was only pride.
I was no ordinary follower. I was an idealist. I will not regret a thing. I have to be honest with you. If I were to say I regret it, it would be a lie. I will leap into my grave laughing, because the feeling that I have 5 million human beings on my conscience is for me a source of extraordinary satisfaction.
This act of hubris, this overwhelming need to have his role acknowledged, would be his undoing. Whispers from the social circle around these interviews found their way into a letter, crossed the Atlantic, and landed on the desk of a German prosecutor named Fritz Bauer. Bauer, a German Jew, knew he could not trust his own government to act. In an act of professional courage, bordering on treason, he contacted Israel directly. The mission was codenamed Finale. A Mossad agent, Zvi Aharoni, was dispatched to Buenos Aires. After weeks of tedious work, he finally located the family's home on Garibaldi Street. But the man living there looked nothing like the imposing SS officer from the files. They needed absolute proof. And then, on the evening of March 21st, they saw it. Riccardo Clement got off the bus carrying a small bouquet of flowers. A quick check of the file confirmed the date. It was Adolf and Vera Eichmann's 25th wedding anniversary.
That is a moment of pure human intelligence genius. You can have photos, you can have an address, but you can still be wrong. But a small personal detail like that, a bouquet of flowers on the correct 25th wedding anniversary, that's the kind of irrefutable proof an operations officer dreams of. It doesn't just confirm the target. It tells you you're dealing with a man of habit, a man with complacency. And complacency is something you can exploit.
It was a moment of pure intelligence genius, a small human detail that confirmed the identity of their monstrous target. A Mossad snatch team was sent. On May 11, 1960, they grabbed him off the street. In a safe house, the terrified fugitive finally confessed his true identity.
My name is Otto Adolf Eichmann.
The ghost was captured. 9 days later, they drugged him, dressed him in a flight attendant's uniform, and smuggled him onto an El Al flight. As the plane's wheels lifted off Argentine soil, Operation Finale was a success. The man who had scheduled the trains to Auschwitz was now on a final, one-way journey to face the judgment of his victims. The trial of Adolf Eichmann began in Jerusalem in April 1961. It was more than a legal proceeding. It was a national catharsis, a history lesson for the world. The chief prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, made its purpose clear in his opening statement.
When I stand before you here, judges of Israel, I am not standing alone. With me are 6 million accusers. Their blood cries out, but their voice is not heard. Therefore I will be their spokesman.
And what of the man in the dock? Eichmann sat encased in his bulletproof glass booth, a physical manifestation of his own detachment.
Eichmann's performance at the trial is a case study in narcissistic dissociation and self-deception. Look at how he organizes his papers. He's trying to impose order on the moral chaos he created. He cannot confront the reality of his actions, so he retreats into the only role where he feels comfortable, that of the administrator. He doesn't argue morality, he argues procedure. To him, being accused of inefficiency was worse than being accused of evil.
His defense was a masterclass in narcissistic self-deception. He wasn't arguing morality. He was arguing procedure. He retreated into the only role he felt comfortable with, the administrator, seemingly more offended by an inaccurate date than by the reality of his crimes. Then came the witnesses. For weeks they came from all corners of the earth, not just to prove a legal case, but to fulfill Hausner's promise. Their testimony transformed 6 million from an abstract statistic into human beings with names, families, and lives. One survivor, known as Kat Setnik, Martin 5633, collapsed on the stand while trying to describe the horrors of Planet Auschwitz.
The Jerusalem trial served a dual purpose. Legally, it was to convict Adolf Eichmann, but historically, its purpose was much larger. For the first time, the story of the Holocaust was being told, in full, uninterrupted, by the survivors themselves, for the world and for a young Israeli generation. Their testimony transformed 6 million from an abstract statistic into human beings, with names, families, and lives. It was history being given its human voice back.
The trial had given history its human voice back. On December 15, 1961, Adolf Eichmann was found guilty of crimes against the Jewish people and crimes against humanity. On May 31, 1962, he was hanged. His final words contained no remorse, only a defiant cry. Long live Germany. Long live Argentina. Long live Austria. Watching the trial was the philosopher Hannah Arendt. She was struck not by his monstrosity, but by his shallowness, his curious and authentically authentic inability to think. She coined a phrase that would echo through history: the banality of evil. Her point was not to excuse Eichmann, but to offer a far more chilling warning that monstrous acts are not always committed by fanatics. They can be committed by ordinary people who simply surrender their moral judgment to the rules of a bureaucracy. The enduring question of Eichmann is, was he a monster? The frightening answer is, probably not in the way we think. He is proof that, under the right conditions, a toxic ideology, a dehumanizing bureaucracy, a diffusion of personal responsibility, ordinary men can be convinced to do unimaginably evil things. Eichmann isn't an aberration, he is a warning. The legacy. The story does not end with his death. Hannah Arendt's phrase, the banality of evil.
Arendt's analysis was brilliant, but controversial. By focusing on Eichmann's banality, some felt she downplayed his fanatical anti-Semitism, which we know from the Sasson tapes was very real. Her core insight, however, remains valid. The Nazi system created an environment where an unexceptional man could become a mass murderer, not in spite of his mediocrity, but because of it.
The enduring question of Eichmann is, was he a monster? And the frightening answer is, probably not in the way we think. He was not born a psychopath. He is proof that, under the right conditions, a toxic ideology, a dehumanizing bureaucracy, a diffusion of personal responsibility, ordinary people can be convinced to do unimaginably evil things. Eichmann isn't an aberration. He is a warning.
Would echo through history. Her point was not to excuse Eichmann, but to offer a far more terrifying warning that monstrous acts are not always committed by fanatics. They can be committed by ordinary people who simply surrender their ability to think, who obey the rules of a system without questioning the morality of the rules themselves. The story of Adolf Eichmann is a testament to the fact that the most profound evil can hide behind the most ordinary face. He was a failure who found success in a system that rewarded his lack of humanity. His legacy is a permanent warning that the deadliest weapon of all is not a gun or a bomb, but the simple, bureaucratic act of dehumanizing others, of turning a person into a number, a life into a piece of cargo, and a moral choice into a logistical problem. The story of Adolf Eichmann, as recorded in history, is over. But the questions he forces us to ask are timeless. How does a society prevent ordinary men from committing monstrous acts? And what is our own responsibility in remembering? This conversation is one that must continue. We invite you to share your reflections on these difficult questions in the comment section below, to engage with a community of thoughtful viewers. If you believe that stories like this must be told, and that their lessons must reach new generations, liking this video helps ensure it is seen by a wider audience. And by subscribing to this channel, you support the mission of keeping these vital histories alive, ensuring that we never forget. Thank you for watching.